So today we're going to talk about the Second World War. And I always start with this particular image. This is obviously Arlington National Cemetery, just outside of Washington, D.C. And in fact, we began this class talking about the end of the Civil War. In fact, that's when this became a national cemetery, because this Arlington, the plantation, this used to be a slave plantation. This was owned by Robert E. Lee. He actually got it from his wife. It was his father-in-law's. And when his father-in-law died, Robert E. Lee inherited this plantation. And so at the end of the war, the government assumed it. The house is still there, but it is now, again, a national cemetery. So oddly enough, this kind of ties back in with the Civil War. But obviously, this is where many American soldiers from the Civil War all the way up till today have been buried. And I think it's appropriate to start with a cemetery. So often people talk about World War II as the good war, or, we think about it, this was the major victory. This is when America became the world power. We think of, our grandparents, or in my case, maybe great grandparents for you guys. But we really do forget, I think, just how devastating this war was. Historians have been able to document about 60 to 65 million people died in this war. And what we're talking about, the official start of the war, September 1st, 1939, which is when Germany invaded Poland. And because of that, France and England declared war on Germany, and that led to everybody else joining, except for us, because we don't actually join the war until December 7th, 1941. So almost really 42 before we get involved. But we think the number is much, much higher than 60 to 65 million. Many historians today are actually thinking that it may be as high as 70 million. You might be thinking, how could you be another 5 million? But when you start talking about Eastern Europe or China or parts of Russia where the records were horrible, there's really almost no telling how many people died. We know, in other words, we know the figure is more than 65 million because the records we do have don't include some of these areas. But what I was getting at, it really only, that number also only covers 1939, and that's sort of the other issue is once you look at this from the worldwide perspective, 1939, the official year of the war, I mean, that's really a European perspective. There's a lot of debate. When does this war begin? Because, 1931, Japan invades a country called Manchuria. Isn't that an act of war? Italy invades Ethiopia in 1935. Germany invades Czechoslovakia in 1937. Japan invades Nanking, which is basically China, in 1936. That all happens before 1939, and we're talking about millions of people that died. I really kind of argue now, if you take my world history class, I blatantly call this war the 30 Years' War. Because to me, this is a war that runs from 1914 all the way to 1945. And in fact, historians are starting to call it that. And I think another 100 years from now, we're not going to call it World War I and World War II. We're just going to call it one big war. Because there's really only a short period in the 1920s where people weren't fighting. For us, it was two distinct wars. But much of the world, it was almost one major war. Anyway, it was a big war. All right, but what we're going to do is back up. We've talked about the Great Depression. But now we're going to kind of talk about what was going on in the U.S., if you will, sort of in addition to the Great Depression. More than likely, your homework will have been a documentary you're going to watch that talks about Europe and Asia. But I'm going to talk about what's going on in the U.S. From the 1930s through 1941, other than the Great Depression. The whole world's in a Great Depression. We've talked about that, but I guess another way of saying this, to be blunt, is where the hell was the United States, even just for 2 years? 1939 to 1941, where are we? And all those things I mentioned before, the invasion of Ethiopia, Czechoslovakia, the invasion of Manchuria, the invasion of China, where were we? And so I kind of want to answer that question before we even get to December 7th, 1941, which is our official start of this war. So again, to get back to the big war just for a second, it is truly a world war. Even though we don't see, necessarily fighting in the Americas, we do see, obviously Hawaii is bombed by the Japanese in 41. We do see some sabotage happening on the American coast. There was believe it or not, there was actually a submarine, a Japanese submarine that actually went into right up to the coast of San Diego. They also sent these hot air balloons at one point, Japan did, with explosives over the Northwest. And the idea is they would land and start forest fires. It didn't work. And we do see fighting in Alaska, the Aleutian Islands. This is islands that kind of trail off at the bottom of Alaska. We do see fighting there. But generally speaking, the fighting would have happened in Northern Africa, Asia, and Europe, but and even on the coast of Australia. But this would have involved every continent except Antarctica. It really is the only war that's fully a world war. And of course, this is one side that we're fighting. This is Nazi Germany, which pretty much took over almost all of Europe. There's a little spot right in the middle. That's Switzerland. Switzerland, because they're surrounded by the Alps, the mountains, they're always neutral. And then at the bottom, that's Spain. Spain was officially a neutral country, but they were really allies with Nazi Germany. So to a large degree, they were really controlled as well. The part in yellow, that's Great Britain. In other words, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and England and Wales. They were the only people fighting the Nazis. By the way, the other part that you see, that's Ireland. Ireland was never part of Nazi Germany, but because they hated England, they didn't want to officially be part of England. So they too were neutral, but they did actually help fight the Nazis as well. And of course, the other side, this is the Japanese Empire. This is what it would have looked like in 1942. This is the largest it will get. After 1942, we will start to shrink this. We did most of the fighting in the Pacific, we, the United States. In Europe, it was actually England and Russia that did most of the fighting until mid-1944 when we started fighting. But we're going to get into that a little bit later. So let's start talking about the US and where were we this whole time? So one thing that comes up a lot, I'm recording this in late March of 2020. We got a pandemic going on, the coronavirus. And, there's a lot of criticism of Congress, a lot of criticism of the president. And you'll hear other people say, oh, we shouldn't ever criticize the president because this is an emergency. We got to stick together, just like we stuck together during the Great Depression and during World War II. And that's completely untrue. The one thing you'll learn when you study history is that to a large degree, nothing changes. Everything changes, and yet nothing changes. There has never been a period in the U.S. history where we've gotten along and where we politically were on the same page. There has never been a period in our history where everybody supported the president. Abraham Lincoln pretty much almost got voted out in 1864. He was entirely unpopular. He barely got reelected. During World War II, Franklin Roosevelt will get investigated by Congress 5 times during the war. So this idea that you can't criticize a president during a time of crisis, that's just un-American, it turns out. And during the Great Depression, Roosevelt was an interesting president. He was, on one hand, incredibly popular. He gets elected 4 times to office. But on the other hand, he was incredibly unpopular as well. Probably a good way to sort of compare him to might be Barack Obama. And meaning Barack Obama, obviously won 2 elections in a row, was very popular with a good part of the country. Obviously, he got reelected. But yet, I guarantee some of you listening to this right now are probably going, Barack Obama, I don't like that guy. I mean, he was a very divisive president. Some people thought he was wonderful. Other people really didn't like what he did. Franklin Roosevelt was very similar. Today we just hear how wonderful he was, but at the time there were a lot of people that really, really did not like Franklin Roosevelt, and some were from the right and some were from the left. One of those from the left was a guy named Huey Long. He was a Louisiana governor for 4 years. And then he became a U.S. senator. And you notice senators, of course, serve for 6 years. And you'll notice the time span there is just a little over 3 years. That's because Huey Long would be assassinated in Louisiana. He too was very divisive. But he was a major critic of Franklin Roosevelt. Now, this is a recorded lecture, but I'm also going to post some videos to go along with this lecture. And I have a couple of videos of Huey Long speaking. We're finally in that period where we can start playing clips from the past. We've had a couple of silent clips I've been able to play, but starting in 1927 with a movie called The Jazz Singer, we start getting into sound movies, including news clips. So for the first time, we can start hearing what these guys sounded like. So you get I have a couple of clips of Huey Long speaking. And one thing you'll notice, you kind of get a sense of this in this photo, all the way up until the 1930s. When you ran for office, for mayor, governor, or president, you spoke to big crowds, but you had to do it with your voice, like an old actor, from way back when, where you just had to speak really loudly. So you gestured really big so people in the back could see you and hear you. Even though by the 1930s, you're starting to get microphones and radio and movies. Franklin Roosevelt was the first presidential candidate to actually use radio. And he was the first president to use the radio as well. But it's funny when you watch these Huey Long clips, you could tell he's yelling to the back wall. You almost want to tell him, hey, you got a mic. You don't have to yell. Anyway, so if you don't mind, pause it, watch those clips, kind of get a sense of what he sounded like, and then come back. So hopefully you did that. And if you did, you probably realized that, he's very critical of both Democrats and Republicans, even though he was officially a Democrat. Although he was moving towards creating his own party. He's, to some degree, and I know I'm going to date this lecture in about 5-6 years. Nobody will know this reference probably, but you guys will. The ones in 2020 will. He's very much a Bernie Sanders type of character. Where he was very much attacking the rich. Although, like Bernie Sanders, he was rich himself. But he had a program that he called Share Our Wealth. He wanted, this is of course 1930s, so the number would probably be a bit higher today, but he thought no one should be worth more than $50 million, which today you'd be talking about a couple billion. But he thought that no one needs to be worth that much money. And he wanted no one to be able to make more than $1 million a year. And basically, if you make $2 million, well, then you got to give $1 million to the government to give to everybody else. So, Roosevelt was often seen as this guy that started welfare and, modern welfare. But his was actually quite conservative compared to what Huey Long. Huey Long was really quite radical for his day. There's a lot of debate how radical was he personally, because he was actually quite corrupt. And again, he was quite wealthy, but he does seem to actually believe this. And again, he was really went after FDR. He thought FDR was kind of a shill. And again, it kind of reminds you the way you might hear a Bernie Sanders talking about, Joe Biden or even Barack Obama. These guys say that they're trying to help the little man out, but they're just part of the establishment. That was Huey Long. And by the way, very popular. Had he not been assassinated, there's a chance he might have been president one day. At the same time, we're starting to see other types of critics of Franklin Roosevelt. And this one might be coming a little bit more from the right to some degree. Again, it's interesting. Today, we look at World War I as an honorable war, and we went in and we saved the world from German hostility. But and again, we forget that attitudes change over generations. And, in the 20s and early 30s, World War One was seen as a mistake in the way that sometimes people talk about the invasion of Iraq, or the way people used to talk about the Vietnam War. People don't really get into the Vietnam War much anymore, but they used to talk about we should never have done that war. That was World War One. A lot of the guys that fought in the war now were in their late 30s and 40s. They were angry. They were bitter because of the Depression. And there was a kind of a conspiracy that developed. This idea that we were fooled into this war, that this war was simply big business trying to make money. And there is truth to that. Big business always makes money from war. I mean, because you need bullets, you need supplies, you need oil. Yeah, war does make money. In fact, the only thing that stops the Great Depression in the U.S. was World War II, frankly. Put men to work, put factories to work. So taking that truth, that turned into, again, a conspiracy that again, we were genuinely faked into this war. If you might remember, the Zimmerman telegram is, the telegram from Germany to Mexico. And that was intercepted by the U.S., and that's what led us to war. A lot of people believe that the Zimmerman telegram was fake, that it wasn't even real. It's the same way as, I hope nobody thinks this anymore, but for a while there were all these people, the truthers, that believed that 9/11 was fake. That's pretty much gone away now, hopefully. This was very similar to that. And so this is the guy you see here, Senator Gerald Nye. He headed up a senatorial investigation looking into the origins of the war. And, they kind of concluded, they thought, they didn't have proof, but they said, we think we should never have gone to World War I. And so as hostilities are heating up in Asia and Europe, there was a sense by a lot of Americans of, oh God, here we go again, not this time. So in 1935, and then again in 37, and I don't have it up here, but again in 39, we officially declared ourselves neutral. We were Switzerland, in other words. We weren't going to help anybody out. We weren't going to trade with anybody. This was not our war. And that's how most of America felt. And that's sort of a big answer to where were we in this war, is that Americans didn't want it. One thing that, we have to remind ourselves, even now, is that the government can only do so much. If the American public isn't behind it, government ain't doing it. And as we'll see a little bit later in this lecture, Franklin Roosevelt is really going to try to get us into this war, and he's going to have a hard time because the American public don't want to. In fact, in 1937, there was a national poll, and it turned out that 2/3 of American voters thought that World War I was a huge mistake, and we never should have gone there. And so again, this is, and since Roosevelt was involved in that war, this is also very much a critique of Roosevelt himself. Another major critic, and again, it's one that many of you probably have never heard of, although he was huge in his day, a Catholic priest who also was a major radio star. I mean, I'm trying to think of somebody that you guys would identify with. I mean, a Rush Limbaugh, Glenn Beck, a Sean Hannity. And I'm purposely mentioning the conservatives because he definitely was, at the time, a conservative. Conservatives today with a big capital C, or just like a liberal with a capital L, both of those movements are kind of modern movements. But he would have been the equivalent of a modern day conservative. If Fox News existed in the 30s, he would have been on it. Very anti-communist. We'll get more into communism later in another lecture, but he also was kind of ironically anti-capitalist, which seems to be like, well, what are you? In other words, he didn't trust big business, but he definitely didn't trust anybody on the left, because to him, anybody on the left would have basically been a communist. But he also does something that I think you see other people today do, and that is he starts out early Depression kind of as a lefty, not completely, but he's definitely, a little bit more of helping the little guy out. but he kind of shifts through the mid to late 30s into somebody that becomes much more of an anti-communist. But from the very beginning, he was always a major critic of Franklin Roosevelt, and he had millions and millions of listeners. And again, if you don't mind, stop for a moment. I have a couple of clips of him talking, and you can see him. And as you watch it, is there anybody he reminds you of? Not an American, maybe, but maybe another world leader. I'm gonna he There's a particular world leader that he seemed to be a big fan of, and it's going to be very obvious in a couple of minutes which world leader I'm talking about. So again, early on, he published a newspaper called Social Justice, and it's funny today in 2020, you hear people talk about, usually in a negative way, about these social justice warriors. Well, Father Coughlin would have been a social justice warrior, but again, kind of coming from the right. Initially, kind of like Huey Long, he really thought that the New Deal didn't go far enough. He also was pretty anti-Semitic, meaning anti-Jewish. And so he also thought that the New Deal was a plot, a Jewish plot to, that where Roosevelt, in fact, many people argued, and I think he did too, that Roosevelt wasn't even Protestant, that Roosevelt himself was Jewish. Some people argued that his real name was Franklin Rosenfeld and that he only pretended to be a Roosevelt. Anyway, so he was very critical of the New Deal early on because he said it didn't go far enough and that it was kind of in league with big business. And then later he just basically says it's a communist plot. So here is a kind of a typical political cartoon of somebody who would have supported somebody like a Father Coughlin. So you have the free economic system, the tree, but it's been chopped down by that evil New Deal. And you can see the products on the right of a free economic system. And these are the fruits of that tree. It's high standard of living, a nice home, a lot of luxuries that our grandparents wouldn't have known anything about. And the American people are going, wait a minute, we seem to like this. But yet there's Franklin Roosevelt, sort of. Franklin Roosevelt couldn't walk, but that's kind of who that's supposed to be, going, we're going to chop that tree down. We're going to do a new tree. This is the New Deal tree. And you got a guy going, wait a minute, why did we do that? And of course, it says new planned economic system, which really is a code word for communism. And since communism was started by Karl Marx, who was Jewish, and then Vladimir Lenin, who helped install it in Russia, was also Jewish, many people argued that communism was a Jewish plot. So not only with this code for communism, but also code for Jewish. In other words, there's a couple layers going on here. There were some other groups that weren't as big as Huey Long and his group, or Father Coughlin and his group, but there were some of these smaller groups, and one that was pretty popular was a group called the Christian Front. And again, it was kind of a vigilante group that wanted to protect America from these outside influences, these Jewish influences. That's one of the reasons they're using the name Christian, very prominent there. But also these foreign influences. There's a bit of an anti-immigrant attitude here as well. This is one of their publications. And again, it's saying, look at what these communists are doing, the onslaught of modern capitalism. And this was one of their publications, The Jewish Problem as Dealt with by the Popes. The sad thing is, the history of the Catholic Church, if you go back to the 1500s, was anti-Semitic. So unfortunately, this is a publication that actually has some truth to it. But they were saying, yes, it's okay to be anti-Semitic. We've always been, we Christians. And, so again, it's very easy to point our finger at Germany in the 30s and 40s and go, look what they did. But again, this is a period where being anti-Semitic was pretty mainstream. It wasn't until after the war that we realize that anti-Semitism is not a good thing. And again, I think for a lot of people, it's quite shocking when you see some of this stuff being, they're not even hiding it. And then you get a little bit darker. This was never as big as the earlier groups, but we are still talking hundreds of thousands of members and even, maybe a couple million people that would have agreed with them. That was a group called the German American Bund. And again, you can see the flag on the left. They're not hiding the Nazi swastika. Now, one thing to keep in mind before I go any further, I do want to be a little bit careful here. This is pre-World War II. Nobody knew about what we now call the Holocaust, and nobody knew that Germany was literally going to take on the entire world and start a world war. So even though people in groups like this would have been, racist, white supremacists, they would have been anti-Semitic, nationalist, but so was the KKK. I mean, in fact, to a large degree, a lot of the guys in the Christian Front and groups like this would have been the KKK members. So I do have to be careful here. This is something that we should rightfully be critical of, but don't mistake this for people who are for slaughtering millions of people. In fact, many of the members of these groups later end up joining the military to fight the Nazis. But still, it is quite shocking to realize that the Nazi Party, or versions of it, were actually popular in the US at one time. And again, some of this is because it is the Great Depression. And what's happening is that some of the American public are going, capitalism doesn't work. Let's go communist. Another side is going, capitalism doesn't work. Let's go fascism. And I'm going to explain fascism in just a moment if you're not familiar with that. Here is the German American Bund at their huge rally in 1939 at Madison Square Garden, which is a massive auditorium. Tens of thousands of people attended this in 1939. And again, right in the middle, that is George Washington, a painting of him. And here's, I like this one just because it's in color. Again, you can see Americans marching with the American flag, but also the Nazi flag. And here is, the German American Bund slightly hid it. Here is actually members of just flat out the American Nazi Party. I mean, there was actually an American Nazi Party. And so here is, again, the poster for the German American Bund celebration at Madison Square Garden. And again, this one's interesting. This was another sort of phrase, America for Americans. And of course, the word not used there is for white Americans or for Christian Americans or for, German, I mean, in other words, there's a lot not spoken here. But the reason I'm using this image is, it says Nazis hail George Washington as the first fascist. And fascism is what Nazis were. They were fascist. So let's talk a little bit about what is fascism. So the word fascism or fascist, fascism is a system, and a fascist is somebody who follows fascism. So the word itself is from the Latin for fasces. And so this is a fasces. It's a weapon. It's really more ceremonial. It's not, people didn't really use this in battle. But it's a bundle of rods. So you can see, you got two versions of it here, but there's a bunch of rods bundled together, tied together with basically, and these rods are sort of surrounding an axe and an axe handle. And the idea is these bundles of rods make it stronger, strength through unity. And it's a classic image. It was sort of the image of the Roman Empire. And really for centuries, people would use this as a symbol of strength. So it's not until the 1920s that you actually get fascism proper. In fact, it's really considered the the only political system that developed completely in the 20th century, because communism and socialism, those were developed in the 1800s. Democracy obviously goes back a lot further, but fascism is a 20th century phenomena. It started in Italy, which is one of the reasons, you're kind of using this, Latin used to be the language of Italy. That's why it has this Italian flair to it. But a guy named Benito Mussolini, who rose to power in Italy, was the first fascist. And then Adolf Hitler was imitating Mussolini. People like Saddam Hussein of Iraq, and to some degree, even Osama bin Laden, basically, instead of saying fascist today, we usually just talk about dictators. That one person that's completely in charge of the country. That's really a fascist leader. And again, that's very much kind of a 20th century kind of image. So what fascists argued is they were looking at things such as racial purity. They were, germ theory, of course, is a biological theory that we get invaded by microbes, we get invaded by germs. Well, a society can also be invaded by germs. So and in this sense, when it says germ theory, it means we have to keep ourselves pure from other races, or we have to keep our country pure from immigrants. And then, of course, social Darwinism, the idea, which is, of course, a warped version of Darwin's ideas. And this is the idea that some races are superior to other races. So fascists, of course, would argue we're the superior race versus those other races. But there's also this sense, and it works very well emotionally, and that's the idea of righting perceived wrongs. We have been wronged, and we're going to fix that. I mean, it works all the time. It's never that we're wrong. It's somebody did something bad to us, and we're going to fix it. It's those people that did this. Again, I'm recording this in late March of 2020. We got the coronavirus pandemic, and, some people are calling it the Chinese virus. It's those Chinese that did it to us. Literally germs spreading it. There's always this sense we're going to blame somebody else, and fascists very much, attach themselves to these ideas. So, for instance, in Germany, they're going to blame the Jews for the reason for World War I, and we're going to fix that problem. In America, it was big business, or maybe it was the immigrants that did it. But another thing that makes it fascist, it's a combination of all of these together. The idea of nationalism, which we've talked about before, this idea that your nation is better than everybody else's. But this is nationalism in one charismatic leader. In other words, that leader is the country. What's good for that leader is good for the country. So Hitler, Mussolini, Saddam Hussein, that were if you think about those countries, Hitler's the most obvious one. When you think of the Nazis, it's posters of Hitler's face everywhere. He's mein Führer, which is German for my father. He is the leader of all of us. Again, he knows best for the rest of us. That is, again, it's a dictator is what we're talking about. Also, again, anti-socialist, anti-communist, because, of course, what do those things argue? We're all equal. They're also very anti-American, usually. Things like all men are created equal. Fascists don't like that. No, that's bad, because fascists said we're not all created equal. That's why we have to keep ourselves pure from those inferior people. But they're also anti-capitalist. Capitalism is about competition. It's about freedom. That's not good. The leader needs to control that. All those businesses are working for the leader. All those businesses are working for the country. Again, sometimes what's good for the country may not be good for a business because they can't make as many profits. That's why they don't like capitalism. Capitalism depends on the idea that we're all free. So this is not that. It is violent. In fact, that's argued is the solution to the problems. You eradicate a germ, you get rid of a pest. That's what you do with your problems. You violently eradicate them. Again, those other peoples are not equal to us. We don't have to respect their safety. We can kill them. We can wipe them out. Genocide. And again, it is totalitarian. Um, Again, the government is everything. Now, again, that sounds a lot like maybe even communism, especially under Stalin or under Mao Zedong of China, or under, the leaders of North Korea today. And you'd be right. There is a lot of, there is a lot of similarities. Um, but again, it's kind of, but then again, communism would say we should all be communists. A fascist would say, no, only us. But your rights don't matter. What matters is what's right for the country. And of course, what's right for the country is what's right for the leader. So it is complete. It is totalitarian. It is the combination of all of these things that make something fascist. It's funny because most of that, well, not most of it, all of it is very un-American, right? Um, And yet, if you look through American symbols, we have had fascist symbols throughout our past. But again, fascism, the fasces meant something very different before the 20th century. So if you look at the Great Seal of the United States, it has the eagle on it. And of course, the eagle in one hand is holding an olive branch, peace. But on the other hand, he's holding his other claw, I guess I should say, he's holding a bundle of arrows, which of course represents the 13 states. And it is basically a fasces. And of course, what do we say? We're the United States. As Benjamin Franklin said, we have to hang together or we're going to all hang separately. There is strength in unity. And again, in the back of one of the earlier dimes is known as the Mercury dime because it has Mercury, the god Mercury on the front of it. But on the back, it's a fasces. And again, e pluribus unum, we're united. But again, it was kind of like almost a left-wing symbol. And again, it was a symbol representing democracy at one time. Again, throughout many of our buildings, all the way up until the 1920s, it would be very common to see fasces to be representative of the U.S. Even if you look at Abraham Lincoln's memorial in D.C., you see sitting in a chair, and on each hand, I always thought they were the backs of books. When I was a kid, I never realized what they were, but they are two fasces. And of course, one's supposed to be the South and the other one's supposed to be the North, and his hands on both of them, because Lincoln held the country together. But again, the fasces here represents the U.S. And here's George Washington leaning on a fasces, representing the United States. But it was this guy, Benito Mussolini, who is really considered the sort of the founder of fascism, the first fascist leader. And what's interesting, we call it a cult of personality. Again, that's what we mean by a charismatic leader, somebody. Celebrities today are kind of a cult of personality where everything about them people want to emulate, the way they talk, the way they wear their hair, the way they dress. I mean, today we call them influencers, right? The Kardashians. And that kind of, I mean, these are the influencers of the day. So a good fascist leader, maybe I should say an effective fascist leader, would spend a lot of time focusing on image, the uniform, the iconography, the music. I mean, there's a reason why if you're an actor, you want to play a Nazi because they have the cool outfits. I mean, the villains are always fun to play, and it's because they're kind of the coolest guys in the movie. When you think of Star Wars, Darth Vader, and I mean, Luke's boring, but Darth Vader, Kylo Ren, those guys are cool. And of course, George Lucas, based the Empire in Star Wars on the Nazis. They're supposed to, I mean, they're supposed to be the Nazis. And Mussolini was the first one to do that. The cool uniform and, these passionate speeches that got everybody riled up. Adolf Hitler used to study him and kind of use him as his model for a while. In the U.S., again, we had fascists, but we also had other groups that may not have been quite as stylish. I don't think anybody wants to look like these guys. But at the same time, again, blatantly fascist groups were very popular. I mean, the most obvious one is the KKK. I mean, they are a fascist group. You could argue they were fascism before fascism was a thing. By the 30s, KKK is not as big as they used to be, but there were these other groups like the Black Legion, who were pretty much another version of the KKK, but were also kind of assuming some of the language of fascist. And again, here is kind of showing this connection. Somebody dressed practically like a Nazi, and then somebody that looks like sort of an even more evil version of the KKK. And one thing, a video I'm going to put up, is there was even a movie that came out that warned Americans about groups such as the Black Legion. And of course, we've talked about lynchings in this class. This is kind of ironic. You see Georgia, and it says lynch law, and you can see somebody lynched in the background. And it says, as the New York World, which is a newspaper, as the New York World, Jew-owned, sees us. Which actually, again, the South did lynch people, sadly. But they're saying that, can you believe these Jews in New York? They think we're all just a bunch of lynchers. They are insulting us. So again, you can see kind of that idea that we've been wronged, and this is supposed to rile people up. Well, Father Coughlin was not officially a fascist, but he starts to lean this way by the late 30s. In other words, these ideas of fascism, racial purity, keeping immigrants out, we need to be a tough America. These were very appealing, especially during the Great Depression. The book you see here was a sort of expose of Father Coughlin. It's called him a fascist demagogue. A demagogue is a leader who uses hatred and fear to rise to power, right? And Coughlin definitely had some of that fascist leaning. If you haven't watched the videos yet, definitely watch them now, because you can hear what is clearly anti-Semitic language being used by Father Coughlin. He is basically saying those Jews of the world, they are going to pay one day. And it almost sounds like he's predicting something, especially today, knowing about the Holocaust. It's very ominous sounding. And people at the time picked up on this. I mean, of course, nobody knew about the Holocaust yet, but people were saying, wait a minute, some of these Americans like Father Coughlin sound a hell of a lot like Adolf Hitler in Germany. And this is a political cartoon showing U.S. fascists, basically walking hand in hand with Adolf Hitler. And you can see the baby carriage full of Coughlinites. Basically they're giving birth to all these little babies that are like Coughlin. So basically what this person is saying is that Father Coughlin is basically a combo of fascism and Adolf Hitler. And by the way, if you haven't noticed yet, at the bottom left-hand side, you can see the signature of the author of this cartoon, and that's, of course, Dr. Seuss. Theodore Giesel, who was a Jewish American himself, the son of an immigrant. He was quite sensitive to what was going on in America, and he was, in fact, one of the first people to really speak out against Nazi Germany, and as well as, fascism in America. I'm going to say this a couple of times, just a quick reminder. We were a neutral country during all of this. So as Hitler was rising to power, we weren't doing anything about it. And it was people like Dr. Seuss that were going, hey guys, we probably should be doing something about this. We need to stand up and speak out. So again, this is Coughlin's publication, Social Justice. Again, you can see the anti-Semitism is pretty blunt. Jews plot to ban social justice. No, do communists control New York City's schools? Communism, again, being code word for Jews, basically. Boycott forces wins to cancel Father Coughlin. Blame for action put on Jewish-controlled advertising pressure. So again, it's whenever something goes wrong, it's their fault. They have wronged us, and we're going to right those wrongs. And I do, without getting too specific, I mean, I do want you to pay attention to modern language today, and I think you might hear our political leaders do that today. Whenever something goes wrong, it's never their fault. It's the media's fault. It's those, I'm getting a little specific there, aren't I? It's those people's fault. It's always somebody else's, and we're going to fix those people. So again, I think when we think of the Great Depression, we tend to think of, the the Dust Bowl and the poor farmers, and there's kind of the sense that we're all in this together. But as you can see, there were massive political divides in the 30s. In fact, much worse than we have today. I mean, thank goodness that Facebook and Twitter wasn't around back then. Could you imagine the social media at that time? But people on the left, they wouldn't have used the word liberal back then. I mean, everyone in America would have called themselves liberal. It just means liberty. But on the left, they saw what was happening in Europe and Asia, the war, both Japan and Germany and Italy, that those were the rise of fascist countries, which they were. So the left said, we have to stop these fascists. Again, Adolf Hitler in Germany, Benito Mussolini in Italy, and the one name you may not recognize, General Franco, the fascist leader of Spain, was rising to power. And if you didn't go to war, you were also kind of on the side of big business. Their argument was, big business are making money off of fascists, which is partly true. Mercedes-Benz and IBM and General Motors and Ford Motors all sold things to the fascist leaders. But on the right, they said that if you supported war, that this was basically a communist plot, which and really a Jewish plot. Now, I mentioned earlier the Nye Committee that said that World War I was basically a plot by big business. What I didn't say is that was code also for Jewish plot. It's funny, the Jews at that point get blamed for everything. Communism, which is anti-big business, they're blamed for that, but they're also blamed for the big banks and big corporations. It's like they can't win. It's like make up your mind, which is it? So there's this sense that this is all a Jewish plot, this is all a communist plot to end capitalism and spread chaos so they can start a communist revolution worldwide. So we shouldn't support the war because that's just what the communists want. These are pretty ugly divides. And again, this is what's part of the reason why we're not in this war, these political divides at this point. And again, some people, just like today, most people aren't really right or really left. Or, we kind of blend a little bit. So a lot of people were angry at the big banks and capitalists, but they were also mad at what they saw to be pro-military and these Jewish plots and these communists, and kind of mix it all up together. And so it does have a huge effect on American attitudes. During World War I, one of the songs that was huge, and you still hear it occasionally, is "Over There." Over there, send our boys over. That's all I'm ever going to sing. It's a huge song. You hear it at 4th of July. Well, a big hit, and unfortunately, I can't find a recording of it. Even though it's sung by the Duncan sisters, who were a big group in the 30s. But this was a big hit. Let's not go over there being Europe, over there being Asia. We're going to stay home. We're going to focus on America. So what you're really starting to see is what is basically known as the America First movement. And this is something I'm going to spend a little bit of time on, because this is a language that you still hear today to some degree. The person you see here is a pilot, an aviator named Charles Lindbergh. Usually I don't have his name up there. If we're in class, I always ask students, can you recognize him? And very few people ever recognize him anymore. Like Charles Lindbergh is not as famous as he used to be. But Charles Lindbergh was, again, a major celebrity in the 20s and 30s. He was kind of a classic American. He was the first person to fly around the world. I mean, we still remember Amelia Earhart, where he was the male version of that. He sort of did it first, and then Amelia Earhart did it. And the reality is Charles Lindbergh was not a very smart guy. He was just it's the way some athletes are, where they're famous because they're good at a sport, but they don't really know anything else. He was a really great pilot. He was really quite naive about everything else. But he by the late 30s, he had become kind of a political speaker. He was somebody that people would listen to. And he was again, sort of in charge of something that becomes known as the America First movement. And that phrase probably sounds quite familiar because you hear it in politics a lot today. And there's a reason why people today, and I'm one of them, that's very uncomfortable with the phrase America First. And I'm going to explain why some of us, especially if you know your history, are uncomfortable with it. So again, take a second. There's a video where you can hear Charles Lindbergh giving his famous speech, where he kind of lays out some of his America First ideas. And there was even an America First committee. And if you listen to the speech, you hear what sounded a bit like anti-Semitism. But at the same time, it sounds kind of rational when not the anti-Semitism part, but sort of like, oh yeah, we need to focus on America first, and we need to focus on our problems. We don't need to solve the problems of the rest of the world. But as we've learned since World War II, it is one world. I mean, not to sound hokey, but it is true. Problems like the coronavirus don't stop at national borders. So what's happening in Mexico, what's happening in China, what's happening in England, if we don't help these countries out sometimes, will be happening here one day. And so that analogy applies then. We know that the rise of the Nazis, the rise of Japan was eventually going to affect the U.S. But there was a naive belief by people like Lindbergh that they really thought we can ignore those problems and just focus on our own problems. And it is very appealing. Again, I say this all the time in history class. It's really easy to let bad things happen if it doesn't affect you. I mean, an example I always use, you and I both know there's homeless people in the world. There's kids being abused. There's children starving in the world right now. But what are you doing about it? What am I doing about it? I'm sitting in my office talking to a microphone by myself. I'm not doing anything about it, right? It's really easy when it doesn't affect you directly. In fact, it's even easier when somebody tells you you shouldn't help them. Don't help those people out. They're not your problem. You go, yeah, you're right. It's not my problem. And that was the appeal of America First. But the problem with America First, now, Charles Lindbergh was, I think, rather innocent in some of his ideas. By the way, I have to give you a little gossip about him. Since this time period, we now know that Charles Lindbergh had another wife. In addition to his American wife, he had a German wife, and he had children with her, and she was a Nazi. And he used to fly over there to be with her. And he also met with a lot of Nazi leaders, and, we still don't think Charles Lindbergh was a Nazi. And in fact, later he apologized for some of his speeches. But this might explain why he was a little bit more like, don't worry about Germany. Germany is our friend. Germany won't hurt us, But while Lindbergh may have been naive, but groups like the Christian Front and the Black Legion and the German American Bund and Father Coughlin, they were all American firsters. And we already know that it wasn't just about America First. It was also anti-Jewish, anti-Black, Muslim, anti-Asian. I mean, there was a lot of ugliness that was wrapped up in America First at that time. It was kind of a pro-Nazi thing. And so that's why when modern day leaders, and you do see Donald Trump here, he likes to phrase America First. And that's why a lot of us are like, whoa, maybe call it something else. Maybe don't use that language, because again, when you say America First, this is what a lot of us think about is the 1930s. So it is in 2016, I don't think he says it as much, but in 2016, Donald Trump did say America first a lot. And he doesn't seem to be a big fan of history. I mean, he really doesn't. I really don't. I think he's kind of like Lindbergh in that I don't think he really understood when he started saying this, the history of that terminology. But it is one of the reasons why I think Donald Trump has been so controversial for many Americans is because he does use language like America first, and it does have it does sound a lot like the 1930s. Anyway, I'm not taking sides here. That's not my job, but I do want you guys to understand that there is kind of a because I've had some students say, well, why does everybody get mad at America first? I'm like, well, because there's a history to that phrase. And I did want you to know a little bit about that. And even if, you know, people who use America First don't always know that it has this history, there are definitely Americans who do know that history. And it is interesting that after 2016, we did see a rise of groups that are basically modern day versions of the Christian Front or modern day versions of the Black Legion. And, like a few years ago in 2017 at Charlottesville, there was an attempt to take down, of course, a statue of Robert E. Lee. And there were some groups that didn't really care about Robert E. Lee. What they really cared about was promoting white supremacy. And, you can see things like this on Facebook. Here is a sign taken at Charlottesville. Hey, white person, you tired of political correctness? Wondering why only white countries have to become multicultural? Figured out that diversity only means less white people, blah, 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 blah. I mean, again, this is kind of hearkening back to fascism. This is hearkening back to the Black Legion and groups like that. It's the same language. It's the same rationale. And notice it's this sense that we white people have been wronged. It's those people that are making us do this. We need to right that wrong. And it is, if you let yourself, it is appealing. Yeah, it's not my fault. They're blaming me. It's their fault. And, you can see how easily this can rile people up. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if one or two of you are reading this going, yeah, you're right. Why does we get, then you have to kind of go, wait a minute, what am I saying? And again, it does seem like in the last couple of years, we have kind of seen some of these 1930s divides sort of coming back a little bit. And I do think that the coronavirus, I know people 5 years from now, this won't mean anything, but right now it does. I do think that what's going on in 2020 with the pandemic is kind of hopefully putting out some of these fires because now we have something we really do need to be focused on. And then, of course, what we're also seeing in the last 3 or 4 years, 2016, 17, 18, is also the rise of a very violent, I shouldn't say very violent, but sometimes violent and an active left, groups like Antifa, which means anti-fascist. And this is, while the guys with the tiki lamps are scary, but I'm not gonna lie, this is also scary to me too. The only good fascist is a dead one. That's no, uh, you know, that's scary language as well. And again, it does seem like a repeat of the 30s a little bit. And this is again a lot of these Antifa people, and again, notice what it really is. And to be blunt, it's mostly young men, and almost entirely young white guys who I think really feel a sense of placelessness, a feeling of not in control of their lives. Maybe they're in debt from college. They're feeling like the world's not listening to them, and they're latching on to something. It might be something on the right or something on the left. And again, that's exactly what happened in the 20s and 30s. A lot of young, mostly men, felt like that the world was out of their control, and they were latching on to something, whether it was communism or fascism or something that to give themselves meaning. And again, I keep saying it. I do see this repetition. I don't think history truly repeats itself, but I do think patterns, and I do think history echoes. All right, I didn't realize. I'll move on. Um, so, speaking of war, Franklin Roosevelt, when he began as president, elected in 32, he was very anti-war himself. In fact, he knew that World War I wasn't a fraud. He was part of that. But he too felt that World War I may not have been such a good decision. And he was very anti-war early on, and he wanted to have nothing to do with what was going on in Europe. And he wasn't that focused on Asia either. But by 36, when he got reelected the first time, he then began to understand that this was something that the U.S., was going to have to deal with. And so he gave a very famous speech in 1936 known as the I Hate War speech. And I should have a little clip that if you pause, you should be able to find it. But basically, he just says, I hate war. In fact, I think the next slide has a little verbiage from it. Yes, this is from the Franklin Roosevelt Memorial in Washington, D.C. I have seen war. I have seen war on land and sea. I've seen blood running from the wounded. I have seen the dead in the mud. By the way, he actually didn't see war, but still. I have seen cities destroyed. I've seen children starving. I have seen the agony of mothers and wives. I hate war. And it's a very powerful speech. And it's partly what got him reelected. Because people were like, yeah, this guy will keep us out of war. He will give the exact same speech in 1940. In fact, also in 1940, he promised America that I will not send our boys to fight in any foreign war. Although in 1940, he knew that we were going to be fighting in a war at some point. It was just inevitable at that point that it was, because by 1940, the world was on fire. I mean, the whole world was fighting except for us. There's no way we were going to stay out of that forever. But when he said, I will keep our boys from any foreign war, he was actually telling the truth. And again, if we were face to face, I'd ask you, how can he be telling the truth knowing we're going to go to war? And this is why I always say you have to listen to these guys really carefully, because they know what they're saying. Of course, he knew that we weren't going to go to some other country and fight unless we were attacked. But of course, once we're attacked, like Pearl Harbor, it's not a foreign war anymore. It's our war. So he told the truth. In fact, we never fought a foreign war. We fought our war. It just happened to be World War II. But again, by the time he gave the speech, he knew he had converted. He'd become a pro-war president, but the American public were not. But he does do something that's almost impossible. And in fact, he did it right before the election. That was a peacetime draft. A draft, of course, is where you have to join the military. But the way he sold this in 1940 was that this was a way to put young men to work. We're going to put them to work, teach them some job skills. And what's ironic is these guys that were drafted only served for a very short period. I mean, just not even quite a year. So half these guys were out of the military by the time we joined the war. But he was trying to get the military ready just in case we do have to go to war. He was already trying to get the military up and running. He also used this as kind of, the argument was this is an economic motivator. We're going to, by building a military, this creates jobs and this gets our economy running. But because of things like the draft, he also got highly criticized by a lot of people on the left. This was a group called the Almanac Singers. And you probably don't know any of these guys, but the really tall guy in the middle is a guy named Pete Seeger. He just died last year. He was in his 90s. He might be somebody some of you know. And on the left is a guy named Woody Guthrie, who we'll be talking about a little bit later in this lecture. But anyway, these are a folk singer group. They were very left. In fact, they were so left, they were completely against war for a while. They thought war was just a fascist plot to get them for young men to die. So they really, really didn't like Roosevelt, because they thought Roosevelt was pro big business, and they thought Roosevelt was just trying to get us involved in a war to make more money for big business. They weren't anti-Semitic, and in fact, half the group was Jewish themselves, so they weren't anti-Semitic in this regard, but they were anti-big business. So in fact, I have two of their songs. So please pause just for a moment and listen and listen to them, because again, we don't tend to think of protest songs coming from the 1930s and 40s. This wasn't these both of these songs are anti-war songs. And again, we tend to think of anti-war songs as being like a 60s thing, Bob Dylan and the Beatles, but actually, again, they were very critical of the president and very critical of World War II before Pearl Harbor. After Pearl Harbor, they will literally change their tune and they become very pro-war after that point. In fact, Pete Seeger and the guy in the middle and Woody Guthrie and the guy on the left both end up serving in World War II. They actually saw action. But at this point, they were very anti-war and anti-Franklin Roosevelt. So here is a magazine rack from 1939. This is, and as somebody who loves magazines and books and comic books and stuff, every time I see this, I think, oh my gosh, I'd love the time machine to buy everything on that stand. But of course, this is a period where people, pre-television, pre-internet, this is magazines and newspapers were huge. But if you really look closely at this image, you'll notice probably a good half of that is comic books. Comic books were huge in the 1930s. That was, by the way, comic books were an American invention. Comics have been around for a while, mostly in newspapers. In the early 30s, somebody had the idea of taking these newspaper comics, because once they appeared in the newspaper, they were done. They never, one day, boom, never to be seen again. So people took all these old newspaper comics and started stapling into basically little booklets. And then somebody said, why don't we just make some original stuff? And so you started getting comic books. And then you get a new invention, and that is the invention of the superhero, which is an American invention. And so I want to talk a little bit about comics and superheroes because it actually directly relates to World War II. So as I said, Franklin Roosevelt was beginning to see the need to go to war, that Nazis in Japan, the Nazis in Germany and the fascists in Japan need to be stopped. There were some other Americans that were beginning to have similar ideas. And in particular, a lot of immigrants. So here is Superman. You guys know Superman. I know he's not as big as he used to be. I grew up on Superman. I used to read the comics. I used to watch the movies. I was, Christopher Reeve played him in 78 and 1980. And then, of course, there was the old TV show from the 50s I used to watch. You guys might remember the one that came out about 12 years ago, Superman Returns. And of course, the DC universe has been making things like Man of Steel and Superman versus Batman and Justice League. But they're all basically the same idea. You have this guy from Krypton, another planet, who comes to Earth because his planet is destroyed. It's basically a holocaust, a fire. Holocaust means everything burns. That's literally what the word means. So it's a literal holocaust because the entire planet explodes in a fiery explosion, right? So he comes to Earth after this holocaust. He's the only survivor, and he has a lot of power here, and he begins to fight for justice. I wonder if any of you know his real name as far as the character. I always ask this in class, and the first answer is always Clark Kent. But of course, that's his fake name. That's his pretend name. His real name is Kal-El. And of course, he's the son of Jor-El. And, Kal-El, K-A-L-E-L, or Jor-El, J-O-R-E-L. The reason I mention that is because those are Hebrew names. That's, you can tell, especially that E-L part are from the Hebrew language. So his name is really a Hebrew name. It's funny, if you watch the movies, whether it's Man of Steel or Superman Returns or the one I watched as a kid, Superman the movie, the imagery is very much Christian imagery. I mean, think about it. It's this powerful being arrives on earth from the heavens. He's the Krypton's only son. In fact, at one point in the older movies, you even hear Jor-El say, "I send you my only son." And he comes to Earth and he does a bunch of miracles. He flies, he stops trains, he stops bullets. At the end of the movie, if you've ever seen the old Christopher Reeve version, Lois Lane dies and he brings her back to life like Lazarus. And in fact, the advertisement for Superman was, "You will believe a man will fly." And in fact, and even in the more recent movies, he several times strikes a pose that is a crucifix pose. And in fact, spoiler alert, if you've seen Man of Steel, he dies at the end of it. But the last shot of the movie is you see the grave and then the ground moves. In other words, it's Superman's heart starting again. He's back from the dead. He is resurrected. So it's interesting. I mean, they're very blunt. They're not hiding it. The reason I think they're so interesting is that the history of Superman is actually not a Christian history, but a pre-Christian history, a Jewish history. The creators, and that's the two guys on the right here, were two teenagers, both Joel Siegel and Joe Shuster. They were both teenagers, originally from Cleveland, Ohio. They were the sons of immigrants, Jewish immigrants. And to them, Superman was a Jewish superhero, with this very Anglo, non-Jewish sounding fake name, Clark Kent. You don't get any more sort of mainstream white bread America than Clark Kent. And again, the experience of Superman very much echoes the experience of immigrants. This somebody that has to hide maybe behind a fake name. A lot of immigrants would change their names, in particular Jewish immigrants. There was, again, as you guys can tell, there was a lot of anti-Semitism at this time. So a lot of people would change their names. I mean, you still see that sometimes today in Hollywood where, they don't use their original names. They'll again, a name that sounds quote unquote less Jewish or less East European. And that's what Superman's doing. He's passing as somebody. He's not saying, "My name is Kal-El, I'm Clark Kent." But he is really Jewish. And a lot of immigrant kids could identify with that. They're like, "Oh, I wish I could tell people how cool I am and all these cool things I am as an immigrant and the cool food I eat and I wish I could speak in my native language. And instead I have to pretend to be something else, And that's kind of what superheroes are. And it's really interesting that if you look at the history of superheroes, they're almost always created by Jewish immigrants. Bob Kane created Batman. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby created, pretty much all of Marvel's, Fantastic Four and X-Men and Spider-Man and Captain America and The Flash and all of that. And all of them are people who have to hide behind a secret identity. And these are all immigrants, And of course, Superman is a literal immigrant. He is from another planet. I have a little, again, a snippet from one of the comics here, and you see Superman's got Hitler by the throat, and it says, "I like to land a strictly non-Aryan sock on your jaw." Of course, Aryan was the old word basically for West European, Caucasians, whites, right? And so Superman's not white. He's not an Aryan. He's not even human. He is the ultimate alien. He's the ultimate immigrant, and he's an illegal immigrant. He doesn't have any papers. He wasn't born here. And so, again, I mean, people could identify with this. And so 39, 40, 41, even though we were officially a neutral nation, which meant we weren't supposed to take sides. I mean, we also had freedom of speech, so, comics could do this. But comic books were one of the only places that were speaking out of what was going on in the world. I mean, if you listen to most of the music, watch most of the movies, listen to most of the radio, it was almost as though nothing was happening. You know, except for the news, there was no mention of what's going on in Germany or Japan or Italy. It was like it didn't happen, except for comics. Comics was the one place where people like Captain America, created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, could beat up Hitler. And again, they're doing this in 40, 39, 40. And again, what's really interesting is that these superheroes today have often been used as an analogies for, in the 60s and 70s, there was an analogy for people of color fighting civil rights. In the 2000s, especially the X-Men were used as an analogy for people who were gay, people who had to pretend not to be gay so they wouldn't get picked on, but they really were. It's funny that, again, superheroes have kind of changed over time. But again, they initially started out as, analogies for the immigrant experience. And again, it was immigrants who were paying attention to what was going on in the world. And that's one of the reasons why, like here, you got basically Uncle Sam as a superhero. Captain America, Superman with his red, white, and blue, right? Immigrants often are the most patriotic people you meet because they're the ones that have chosen. Um, you know, I was born here. Most of my students were born here. We didn't choose to be Americans. We just happen to be American. But immigrants choose to come here. And so they tend to often be even more patriotic than those who were born here. Because we take it for granted. They don't. And you see this, I think, in the superheroes as well. My favorite thing, and this is where I took that little clip from a second ago, this was, as you see, February 27th, 1940, from Look magazine. And basically, the Look magazine said, hey, if Superman was real, what would he do? How would he solve the world's problems? And so basically, you see Superman stopping, all the fighting going on in the world in 1940. And he grabs the leaders like Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler, and he takes them to the League of Nations to stop what was going on. And again, at the very top right, you can see the little panel that I showed you a moment ago. By the way, superheroes had a problem. Before I get to this image, one of the problems with superheroes is, and it's always been the problem with superheroes, is if they really are superheroes, why is there famine? Why is there war? Because they can stop everything. So it was kind of hard, comics during World War II, because what kids would say is, why doesn't Superman just stop it all? Anyway, sometimes I can see students, when I talk about this in classroom, going, oh my gosh, Dr. Nelson's he's going deep on this. This is crazy. But people were paying attention to these comic books, and one of the people paying most attention was a guy named Joseph Goebbels. If you're not up on your Nazi history, Joseph Goebbels worked very closely with Adolf Hitler. He is the guy that came up with most of the ugly imagery of the Nazi Party. He made a lot of those really anti-Semitic movies. He created all the posters. He was a guy that, he really got anger about Jewish people. So Germans who began to support the Nazis, and said, yeah, those Jews are terrible. Now, a lot of that was Joseph Goebbels really rallying that up. And he did not like Superman, the comic book. He says Superman was a Jewish propaganda tool. So here is a quote from one of the Nazi publications. And this was published later in the U.S. in some publications. Superman is a Jew. Jerry Siegel, an intellectually and physically circumcised chap who has his headquarters in New York, is the inventor of a colorful figure with an impressive appearance, a powerful body, and a red swimsuit who enjoys the ability to fly through the ether. The inventive Israelite named this pleasant guy with an overdeveloped body and underdeveloped mind Superman. He advertised widely Superman's sense of justice, well suited for imitation by the American youth. And it would go on to say that don't be fooled by this Jewish propaganda tool. So Joseph Goebbels and the Nazis recognized something that many Americans didn't really pick up on. And that is Superman was Jewish, but he wasn't a propaganda tool. He was an American saying, hey guys, the Nazis were bad guys, which is why Goebbels is going, shut up, we don't like you. But anyway, so it is interesting that of all things in America, one of the only parts of the media that dared to speak out was superheroes. And that was because they were written by immigrants who are actually paying attention to the world, while your average American wasn't paying attention to anything. And earlier I showed you Madison Square Garden, where the pro-German Nazi group gave a program. Also in 1939 at Madison Square Garden was another group, a boycott Nazi Germany group. And of course today, we're like, yeah, but this is almost entirely immigrants. Because like I said, most Americans were not paying attention to what was going on in the world. And they were saying, hey, there's a lot of companies that are dealing with Nazi Germany. Maybe we shouldn't buy their products, because by buying their products, we're kind of helping the Nazis out. And so here is, again, in a Christmas parade, do not buy Nazi-made toys. This one is a non-sectarian, meaning any religion, anti-Nazi league. And there's Santa Claus going, yeah, Nazis stink, buy American toys. This is not quite America First, but it's kind of the same imagery, isn't it? And again, if you know your history and if you watched the documentary, you know that throughout the 1930s, in particular in Germany, but also elsewhere in Europe, they were rounding up Jewish peoples and imprisoning them and passing laws against them and eventually putting them into concentration camps. Now, nobody knew how far that was going to go at this point, but in 39 and 40, there were Americans going, mostly immigrants going, hey, this is bad. Maybe we should do something about this. So there were groups like the Jewish Relief Campaign. One of the saddest stories is the story of the St. Louis. This was a ship that picked up several hundred Jewish immigrants from various parts of Germany and other parts of Europe to bring them to America so that they could escape the Nazis. And they weren't allowed in at all. Nobody and that was because we had the quotas about immigrants. Remember 1924, the National Origins Act. Nobody from various countries were allowed into our country, and that included these people. So we turned them away. And London, which had similar laws, London, England, turned them away as well. But in London, they did allow the children to stay. So the children were offloaded and allowed to stay in England, but all the adults had to go back to Germany. And we know that almost every one of these people died in a concentration camp. In fact, several died at Auschwitz. And again, America and England didn't know that there were these death camps waiting for them. But it is still, you do see how things like anti-immigrant attitudes and these immigration laws do have huge repercussions later. So let's talk a little bit about 1941, and then I'm going to do this in two parts. So we'll kind of wind up this first part with us actually entering the war. So 1941, this is the only year that we'll go into detail about, but let's talk a little bit about what's going on in 1941. So there is starting to be some recognition that the world is getting scary. Most Americans do not want to go to war, but there is a growing sense that the war might come to us. So because of that, we are able to get our military a little bit more in order. And it's interesting because during this time, 39, 40, and into 41, England was pretty much the only country in Europe that wasn't Nazi by this point. And literally, the Nazis were bombing England and Scotland every night, just constantly bombing them. And Winston Churchill, who was the leader of England, he was the prime minister, he was good friends with Franklin Roosevelt. He wrote Franklin Roosevelt a huge letter, several page letter, and basically saying, you have to help us. You're it. If you don't help us, we're going to fall and you're going to be Nazis next. And he was right. The letter went to Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt was on vacation. By the way, no president went on vacation more than Franklin Roosevelt. And he happened to be fishing off the coast of Florida with a friend of his, a guy named Harry Hopkins, who worked for Roosevelt. In fact, Churchill was furious when he found out that Roosevelt was fishing, while he's being bombed. Anyway, Roosevelt reads this letter, and it's very scary. And he doesn't talk about it for a couple of days. But finally, at some point, he turns to his friend Harry Hopkins, and he says, imagine if your neighbor comes to you and their house is on, your next door neighbor, and their house is on fire, and they come to you, they knock on your door, and they ask for your garden hose. What would you do? And Harry Hopkins said, well, I'd give them my garden hose. He's like, yeah, why would you do that? And Hopkins said, well, for one thing, he's my neighbor. I need to help him out. But if I don't help him put his fire out, that fire is going to spread to my house. He's like, right. And he said, would you ask for money? Or would you demand, like, hey, put a deposit down? And Harry Hopkins said, no, I wouldn't worry about it. It's an emergency. I wouldn't worry about the garden hose until afterwards. Then we could worry about it. And Roosevelt said, exactly. That's what I was thinking. And so basically, Roosevelt formed a plan. So when he got back from vacation, he immediately went on the radio and he told the same story. He said, imagine if your neighbor's house is on fire. Blah, blah. And so then he said, that's happening right now. Europe is on fire. China is on fire. They need help from us. We need to help them. We're not going to worry about them paying us yet. We can worry about that later. Because if we don't put these fires out, we're going to be burning. Then he said, Congress passed this law. This was a huge foreign policy decision that Franklin Roosevelt just kind of made up on his own. I do not recommend this. Even though it turned out to be a great plan, this is not how you're supposed to do things, by the way. But the American public totally agreed with him on this, because it would keep us out of war, but also it gets the factories running again. It gets people to work. But there's something else here. We're not going to war yet, but we've picked a side. We are not neutral anymore. We have chosen a side, and we are against the Nazis. We are against the fascists. We have picked a side. And this is a famous image. These are kids in Russia. Now, Russia, if you watch the documentary, Russia, a communist country, had teamed up with Hitler. Hitler hated communists, but Hitler and Russia had decided to work together. Then Hitler invaded Russia in summer of 1941. So therefore, Russia became one of our allies for a while. So once they became an ally, we began to help them out. So these are Russian children getting food from American farmers, which of course helps the farmers out, right? So we are involved in this war now. And again, that's always interesting because we tend to think of Russia as being our enemy. I mean, even today, we're really in a Cold War with Putin and Russia. They're not our friend. But during World War II, they were our friend. So it is interesting. This man is your friend. He fights for freedom. He's a Russian. Another way we pick sides. So that's on the European side mostly. The Lend-Lease was really much more about Europe, even though we helped China out. But we also decided to stop selling oil to Japan. That's what we mean by an embargo. Now, Japan is just a series of islands. They don't have oil. They were dependent on our oil. So if we quit selling them oil, they're desperate. They need oil for tanks, for trucks, for cars, for airplanes, for ships. They have to have oil. Roosevelt, you hear conspiracy all the time that Roosevelt knew that Pearl Harbor was going to happen. There is no evidence of that whatsoever. That's just a conspiracy theory. However, he and many people knew that once we did this, that they were going to do something. We just didn't know what and how, because they're going to have oil. This was a huge. I mean, this was almost an act of war. The fact that we weren't selling them oil, and they are going to do something because they're going to need to get oil from the Dutch East Indies and from other places. But they know that if they invade those places, we will probably stop them. So what they're going to end up doing is coming up with a plan. They started in the summer of 1941, a plan to get rid of us. And of course, that's going to end with Pearl Harbor. Also, in late summer of 1941, Roosevelt invited the King and Queen of England to come to the U.S., which is funny because it's the first time that an English monarch ever came to North America. Isn't that weird? We were a British colony. By that point, it had been 170 years since we declared independence, and not one British monarch ever came here until 1941. So in other words, Roosevelt is trying to cozy up, if you will, with England. I mean, we were already friends, but he's really going, hey, look, we're your friend. But a little bit after that visit, he and Winston Churchill, that's the guy who was sitting on the right, he was the Prime Minister of England, he and Roosevelt secretly met in the North Atlantic. And it was a total, I mean, they had a look-alike at Churchill walking around London, so people thought he was still in London. Roosevelt pretended to be on a trip to Florida, but they were secretly meeting on a ship in the North Atlantic, which was incredibly dangerous because Nazi U-boats were patrolling the Atlantic left and right. So this was actually really dangerous. And they met, and they came up with an agreement. By the way, Roosevelt's vice president did not know about this. Congress did not know about this at the time. The State Department did not know about this at the time, but they came up with a major agreement. The short version is that we agreed that once we got involved in this war, we would go after Europe first, which is a pretty big deal, especially considering it was Japan that attacked us. But yet we had to go after Europe first. The next slide you don't need to worry about for the exam. Europe first is the part you need to know about. But this is what the Atlantic Charter also said. No territorial gains will be sought by the US or UK. By the way, UK was a major empire. That's what UK wants, is to make territorial gains, but they are so desperate they agree to this. We will respect the wishes of the people of these territories. Everybody has a right to self-determination, no more trade barriers, blah, blah, If you remember World War I, this is Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Now, as a historian, I am not a fan of Woodrow Wilson. I think he made a lot of bad mistakes. I think he was a racist. I think, but I'm a big fan of Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt loved Wilson. So I don't know where that leaves me. But Franklin Roosevelt, to some degree, was trying to bring back the 14. The 14 points were actually really good. I mean, I think everybody would agree with what's in these ideas. It's just interesting that Roosevelt was really trying to bring back Wilson's ideas. And he's trying to make them stick. Churchill doesn't agree with any of this. But he wants our help, so he agrees to it. By the way, the end of World War II ends imperialism. We talked about that already. This is the end of imperialism. And that's what this is. These are statements that are anti-empire. So Japan and Germany both recognize that, it's very obvious to them that we are no longer neutral. And the last thing they want is us in this war. We were a giant country, with over 100 million people, with our own oil, our own precious metals, our own natural gas. We have massive factories. They don't want us in this war. Now, in the Atlantic, Navy ship was sunk in September of 1941. A couple of people were killed. Germany apologizes for it. And it probably really was an accident because they don't want us in the war. Then a little bit later, the USS Reuben James, a Navy ship, was sunk, and everybody on board was killed. And about 150 men. This is an act of war. Now, again, Germany apologized and said, we thought you were a British ship. We didn't know you were an American ship. And that very well may actually be true, because Germany really did not want us in this war. But it is two ships now, and over 100 Americans have been killed. This is like 9/11, except the American public did not want to go to war. Franklin Roosevelt was getting ready to declare war. I mean, he had a message ready. He was about to go to Congress to deliver that message when he realized that the American public would not support him on that. Even, again, can you imagine that today? But even with this accident, many of the American public were not ready for war. Now, having said that, some of the people who were anti-war, such as the folk singer Woody Guthrie, um, became pro-war at this point. Woody Guthrie, in fact, wrote a song called "The Ballad of the Reuben James," and I do have a video of it. It'll stick in your head forever. But basically, uh, it goes on to say, "What was their names? What was their names of the good men on that Reuben James?" But he basically said, "It's time to go to war. We need to go to war." And he started on his guitar. He wrote, "This machine kills fascists. We need to rally together." But most of the American public weren't quite ready for him. Oh, by the way, I meant to say Woody Guthrie is, you may not know the name, but you probably know some of his songs. The most famous song is "This Land Is Your Land." That's a Woody Guthrie song. But of course, it took the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. And this was what they began to plan in the summer of 41 with the oil embargo. And it worked. It was, from their perspective, it was brilliant. I mean, they absolutely faked us out. We knew something was up. We didn't know what, but it absolutely worked. And with this event, the American public is now ready. And I'll talk more about this in the second part, because I realize this has been going on about 90 minutes. Because again, World War II is massive. It usually takes me about 3 or 4 classes to cover the whole thing. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here. This will be part 1, and then we'll pick up with part 2. We'll start with Pearl Harbor, and we'll go through the war. Alrighty, guys. Thanks.